I'm recording on 2 devices right here, y'all. All right, so this right here is called the transverse fracture. Okay, hopefully you remember way back to theme 1 where we talked about different planes and sections and regions. And you remember that transverse is a plane that runs horizontal to the ground. It's just straight across like this. That's a transverse fracture. That should sound really familiar, like I say, because we've talked about that word before. Typically what happens with the transverse fracture is you have a bending force at the ends of the bones. Or bone. Okay? So like this bone is bent this way, and this is bent the same way, and it snaps it right here. Like if you took a carrot in your hand. Why is it zoomed in so much? There we go. If you took a carrot and just bent it at the ends, it would snap straight across like that. That's a transverse fracture. Questions about a transverse fracture before I go on to the next one? How's my pacing so far? Perfect? Good. Okay. So now I'm going to draw another one. I know. This is going to be broken not transversely, but obliquely. See that? Now the angle of the bone, or the angle of the break, is not transverse. It is oblique. And so usually what happens here is not just a straight bending force, but a twisting force at the ends of the bones. Cool? So the bone is twisted and that causes the bone to break more obliquely. Bones are actually very strong at handling compression forces. So if we were just pushing straight down on this bone, like our, you figure walking around, your weight is just pushing straight down into your bones. They're very, very strong that way at handling those compression forces. But at bending and twisting, they're much less strong. So that's an oblique fracture. Now this next one is called a spiral fracture, and it looks a bit like an oblique fracture, but it's a worse fracture. It's more complex and results in more serious injury. It's called a spiral fracture, and it's a little bit tricky to draw. Because, see, we've got to kind of have a three-dimensionality to the break. So it's like, see how I've got the front of the bone and the back of the bone? I'll kind of color in this back part here. Does that make any sense? So it's a more complex fracture where the bone is the fracture kind of has this three-dimensionality to the break, where this is in the up front in the drawing and this is in the back in the drawing. So the bones, it's just more complex. But that's a spiral fracture, and that's also the result of a twisting force. But not always at the ends of the bones. This can come more centrally located. Fracture. More centrally located force, I should say. So if the bone's twisting, then it can kind of do this spiral thing where it runs up and down the bone linearly. Any questions? Let me know if I need to slow it down or whatever. Otherwise, I'm just going to I'm drawing 9 bones total. So we're almost halfway there. Okay, this next one is a much more serious fracture. It's a darker green, but yeah. So you might call this a shattered bone. The word is comminuted. It's a comminuted fracture. And this is where the bone breaks into pieces, right? Chunks of the bone are broken off. There's little bits and fragments all over the place. This is a much bigger problem. This is due to a crushing force. And a pretty powerful force. You know, this could be car accident, an elephant stepping on you, that sort of thing. My brother fractured these 3 distal phalanges here on, I forget which hand now. My brother, he used to work with rigging equipment on oil derricks, but he had his hand down on a big metal something or other, and then the crane dropped something like 16,000 pounds of metal right there on his fingers. And that crane operator freaked out and went to lift it off his fingers. Some of the rigging came loose and it smashed back down on his fingers. And then it took him a couple of minutes to get it off of there. And I guess when he says when he pulled his fingers out, they were just like coins at the end of his fingers, like discs, just flattened and round like a cartoon. And when he went to the doctor said it was just like they took a piece of chalk in a bag and just smashed it up into little powder, his bones here. So that would have been comminuted fracture. Somehow they did not have to amputate the fingers. I don't really understand that, how the bone healed. They don't. They're like this now. They don't. He can't straighten them out. They're always bent like this. Anyway, now he picks up dog poop for a living. Okay, comminuted. Okay, our next fracture. Got kind of a blue-green color here. I think I left them way over there somewhere. On that table, that desk, that student desk over there, one of those two? See it? Yeah. Okay. I don't know why I did that. Okay, this next one's a little bit different. So we draw the bone. Okay, now down here is where the fracture occurred. So what I did is I broke off this epicondyle, is what that's called. Okay, this is called an avulsion fracture. So remember that muscles are attached, well, you may not remember, but muscles are attached to bones by tendons, and bones are attached to each other by ligaments. So let's say we got a ligament here. We probably saw some of these. That was sprinter, girl that was doing her TikTok dance, and probably the gymnast also. Those looked more like dislocations than fractures. But in a dislocation, because the bones separate from the joint, the ligaments can pull so hard that you do end up with fractures as well. So here's a ligament. I'm going to label that ligament. Okay, and so this would be connecting this femur to the tibia below. Look, my bones just keep getting longer. Anyway, as the ligament is pulled, it actually rips bone free with it. Okay, so tendons and ligaments are actually very, very solidly attached to bones. So this is where a ligament or a tendon rips bone off, pulls bone free. I like that better. That sounds nicer. And that fractures the bone. It pulls a piece of the bone away from the major part of the bone. And that is an avulsion fracture. Questions? Comments? Concerns? It's all good? How many have I drawn? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Alrighty. 3 more. 3 more, y'all. Told you, simple. Simple and fast. Lickety split. Okay, so now this next one's a little different. Okay, this is called an impacted fracture. I said that bones are very strong at handling compression forces, but of course, you know, things can happen. So, under great amounts of force, like maybe you jumped off a tall building, the bone can kind of, because the bone is ramming into itself because of compression forces, the bone can fracture and kind of do this kind of splintering thing here.
I've had that. I've had that. When I was little.
Oh, you've done that. Oh, what'd you do?
My mom had a lifted Suburban, and I was like 3, so I would just jump out of it.
Really? And that happened?
Yeah, my shins.
That's crazy. That must have been a really tall Suburban.
And these are femur bones?
Yeah, all these I've drawn are femurs. Of course, this could be any bone. It's just that I'm only drawing femurs. Both of your shins, you said? Both of your tibias?
Just my right.
Right one. So this is an impacted fracture. This is where it's compressed. From end to end.
And it's impacted?
Impacted, yeah. Yeah, that's an M. Not a very good M. Impacted. So, yeah, this can be from jumping off of a very high height. Also, older people, especially females, oftentimes get impacted fractures due to a loss of bone density. So the bone starts to get brittle and weak. Okay? Now this one's a little different. This one you might call a hairline fracture. But this is just where you get kind of like a break here that doesn't break all the way through. It's called a fissure. Some people call it a hairline. I'll write hair over here. But it's more appropriately called a fissure. So this is where just where the force is not great enough to break the bone all the way. And so you just get a crack running through the bone. All right, and this last one mostly happens with little kids. Have you ever taken a branch off a tree, a live branch, a green branch, and you go to break it and it bends and bends and bends and then finally kind of splinters but doesn't break all the way through? That's what this is. So we got to draw this one at an angle. And right here it's just kind of splintering. And we usually see this with very young people, little kids, because their bones haven't fully hardened yet. Maybe you've seen little kids, and they can take a pretty nasty fall, and it just really looks like it's going to be the end of the world. But they just hop right back up, and it's all good. Because little kids, their bones haven't fully hardened yet. It takes many years for our bones to fully ossify and get really hard and rigid like they will end up being. Little kids' bones are a bit bendy. Green stick. Yeah, so this is called a green stick fracture. So this is where bendy bones, bendy bone does not break all the way. And normally we see this in little kids. Not always, but normally normally with little kids, where the bones are just not fully hardened, not fully rigid, and they can bend and bend and bend, and then finally they can kind of splinter and just don't break all the way through. So that's called a green stick fracture. Cool? Look at that. Any questions about these different types of fractures? And how they're created? How they happen? Okay. So just a little bit more to say in this space down here. If you break a bone, the ends, the broken ends can either stay in place or they can shift, right? Depending on how bad the fracture is or what you do immediately after the injury takes place. So the bones, they can shift out of place or they can stay in place. So what we call this, the terms for this are either displaced or undisplaced. So there's like a couplet here. Okay, so a displaced fracture would be where you've got a broken bone and then the other end, right, it doesn't line up anymore. So this would require a surgery to fix. This is where the bone moves out of place. So this is where, you know, doctors are going to have to cut you open and put these bones back where they belong and put pins and screws in there. That's not what you want, okay? Where an undisplaced fracture is where the bone breaks, but everything just stays right there in line. All your muscles and connective tissues and everything have done a good job of holding that in place. And so the bone breaks, but it doesn't shift. That's better. If you get to pick, that's the one you want. So the bone stays right there where it's supposed to.
So bone breaks but doesn't shift?
Yeah, it's not shifted out of place. It's still lined up just where it's supposed to be. Okay, and now another way that the fracture can occur, another way this injury can occur, is either what we can call simple or compound. What's a compound word? Compound word? Two or more words put together to make a new word, like rainbow, right? Okay. All right, so a simple fracture is also called a closed fracture. Whoops, that should be an S. It's called a closed fracture. And a compound fracture is also called an open fracture. So a simple fracture is where the bone does not pierce the skin. Where an open fracture is where the broken bone pierces the skin. And so we call it a compound fracture because now you have more than one injury. You got a broken bone plus an open wound. And so that's worse. You open it up to infection, right? You don't want to get infection in your bone. Osteomyelitis, that's a bad juju. So I told you, those are simple notes. Knock them out real quick, 15, 20 minutes. Questions, comments, concerns?
What are we doing now?
Now we're going to start an activity. X-rays. We're going to identify X-rays.